this video, I'd like to discuss stretching the entire front area of the hip, which we typically refer to as the hip flexors. I'm going to position myself sort of sideways here so you can see exactly what it is that I'm doing. And I'm setting up in what we refer to as a half kneeling position. We can stretch this area in a variety of ways, but this is among the most practical and easiest. At least that's what I've discovered over my many years performing these stretches. I'm going to go ahead and tuck my shirt in so you can clearly see what is happening. I've got the stanchion behind me. I'll talk about that in a moment, as well as this little device here that I'll use to create some tension. Again, you don't need this specifically, but something similar to it can be helpful. Now, when we look at the front of the hip, we've got two basic areas we want to focus on. In this tissue, it's all the same tissue. I think of it as a bunch of goop, really, from here all the way down to the knee and into the leg. Essentially, it's all the same tissue. We can separate the muscles, talk about the tensor fasciae lata, the quadricep, the psoas, the iliacus, but the bottom line is we want to think of this entire area as all the same tissue. And really, we're going to focus on two segments of this. So we've got this front of the hip area right here, sort of right adjacent or in front of my hip joint itself. And then the quadricep is the other major area that I tend to think about. Now, the amount of knee bend that I have in these positions is what predominantly determines how much stretch I have in the quadricep. So I'm going to start in a half kneeling position, and then I'm going to move to a position where my foot is elevated on the stanchion. Again, you could use a chair, a table, you could even use the wall if you wanted to, although that's not typically very comfortable, but it could work. Bottom line is we'll start in this half kneeling position first. So the way you want to set this up is to make sure you're in a relative neutral pelvic position. And to give you an idea of how that should look or not look, we could imagine if I were to let my pelvis tip all the way forward like this, I could come and just like stretch way out here, but not necessarily get a good effective stretch in the front of the hip. Similarly, I could posterior tilt like this, and that's not necessarily what we want either. We just come into that neutral pelvis position, and again, thinking back to our foundation program where I discuss what is a neutral pelvis, we talk about the pelvis as a bowl, right? So we want to bring our pelvis into a position where that bowl is relatively even so that were it filled with water, water wouldn't spill out to the front, it wouldn't spill out to the back. And once we do that, what you can see that I'm doing here right now is creating tension in the hip, and I'm putting a little bit of pressure into the floor with my knee and with that front foot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my entire hip forward. So my entire body, starting with the hip forward. And if I maintain that neutral pelvic position, what I end up with here is a really nice stretch, passive stretch of this anterior hip through this region. I haven't added a lot of stretch yet to the quadricep. That's our second area, if you recall. But we'll do that once we get the foot up onto the stanchion and add a little bend into our knee. So this is our first stretch position and where we want to come into. And if we come all the way forward and drive that knee right into the floor and squeeze hard through our glute and hip, we can get a really nice effective stretch. And I want to stay here for a minute to 2 minutes before then introducing our rear foot elevated position. So let me go ahead and come into that now. What's important about this position is you could use your hand, you could use, as I said, a table or a chair. For our purposes and with pails and rails, we want that surface though to be fairly firm. And what I'll do is I'll demonstrate how I use my hand to really create full body tension and execute that pails and rails. I mentioned I would talk about this. This is again a basic stanchion to provide a little bit of extra support and balance, and can actually help me to radiate some tension once I get into pails and rails. So if you can find something around your home or training area that it will provide a similar purpose, that's all we're looking for. Of course, these are great as well. So now that I've got my foot elevated in the back, I've added an extra element of stretch to my quadricep. So I can come back into that fully hip stretched position. Now if I feel it's too much in the quad, then what I can do is just move my knee forward and take some of the bend out of the knee. This relieves some of the tension in the quad. As I move my knee closer to the stanchion, as we decrease the angle at my knee, I'm increasing this stretch here. So you probably noticed I'm sitting back a little bit with my hips. I want to go ahead and create some tension in this right hip, squeeze this glute, and start to move forward, maintaining that neutral pelvic bowl. So I've moved my knee back. I'm now pushing my hips forward. For me, this is darn close to what is my end range for this position. And this is what you want to, this is the position you want to go through over the course of a couple of minutes. Start in half kneeling, elevate your foot, squeeze that hip, move forward, maintaining that neutral pelvic bowl, and then elevate that foot to bring your quad into place. Make sure to have adequate protection for your knee in that position. So if you need an extra pillow, if you have an AirX pad on hand, that's a great tool. You want to make sure to protect the kneecap and make sure, obviously, that you're not stressing that area too much. Remember, you can move the knee forward or backward when your foot's elevated to either add or subtract tension from the quad, remembering that your goal is to find end range. So to quickly review, we'll start in the half kneeling position. Then we'll find that neutral pelvic position and move our hips forward so we get massive, good stretch from the front of the hip, our first area of focus. Try to spend a minute or so in that position, then elevate the rear foot and bring the quadricep, our second area of focus, into the stretch. This is challenging training, but so beneficial.